Hello, today you will hear a story with unexpected plot twists and lots of intrigue. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel and like it. It motivates me to write more amazing stories for you. It's also interesting to find out which corner of the world you're watching this video from. And now we begin. A portrait with no name. In the attic of a crumbling estate, where ivy crept through broken window frames, a forgotten portrait lay hidden beneath a moth-eaten sheet. It wasn't found by chance. It was as if the house itself had chosen to give it up. Dust danced in the golden shaft of late afternoon light as the cover slipped off. The face in the portrait was haunting young, beautiful, full of something between longing and sorrow. But the strangest part was the nameplate beneath it. It had been scratched out violently until not even the first letter could be read. No one knew who she was, not the new caretakers. Not the villagers who whispered stories about the estate on the hill, not even the man who had purchased the property at auction a month ago. But the painting seemed to know them, and when the wind passed through the cracked walls, the attic door creaked open, not in fear, but in invitation. The story begins not with her death, but with the moment she was forgotten. And in this story, forgetting was never accidental. The Durnwood estate stood like a fading monument at the edge of the northern moor, where the grass never grew quite green, and the air always smelled faintly of something old. For years it had remained empty-abandoned after the last of the family line disappeared without explanation. A lonely, elegant ruin that overlooked the village below. Its windows were clouded with time. The garden had reclaimed the walkways, and yet, even in its decay, it kept something of its old dignity, like a woman who, even in grief, refuses to bow her head. That summer, a historian named Julian Wren purchased the estate, hoping to turn it into a retreat for writers. He arrived with 2 assistants and little knowledge of what had happened there. The village offered warnings disguised as politeness. "A beautiful place, but a touch unlucky," said one. "Best not to go poking in the past," said another. Julian smiled. He didn't believe in village ghosts. On the 3rd day, while exploring the west wing, they found the attic sealed from the inside. The lock was rusted shut, the handle splintered, as if someone had once tried to keep whatever was inside from ever getting out. When they forced the door open, it wasn't dust or mold that made them pause. It was silence, the kind that presses against your skin. The portrait stood there, draped in heavy cloth, alone, waiting. Julian wasn't a man prone to superstition, but something about the portrait unsettled him. He had it brought down to his study on the ground floor, where he could examine it in better light. The face on the canvas was lifelike, strikingly so. Her eyes were wide, grey, almost silver in the right light. Her hair cascaded in soft curls, and her dress was simple but elegant. Perhaps Regency era, he guessed, but it wasn't just the quality of the painting, it was the feeling it left behind, a presence. "She seems familiar," his assistant Claire said one evening, "though I swear I've never seen her before." They tried to research the family, but records were oddly incomplete. No marriage certificates, no death records, only the names of 2 sisters, Ellen and Mariette Durnwood, and a vague note in a church ledger. Final service held. Closed to all but family. Claire asked why the nameplate was scratched out. Julian didn't answer. That night, Julian dreamt he was standing in a rose garden. The flowers were pale, almost colourless. The woman from the portrait was there, back turned, walking away. When he called out, she didn't turn. She simply faded into the mist. He awoke to the sound of footsteps on the stairs, but when he checked, no one was there. They kept the portrait in the study, though Claire begged him to cover it at night. "It's not her eyes," she said. "It's that I don't think they're looking at me. I think they're watching something behind me." Rumours returned quickly to the village. Some said the estate had awakened. Others whispered of the girl with no name. Old Mrs. Hanley, who'd been a maid there when she was a child, came to the gate one morning, holding a pressed flower in her hand. She was the younger one, she said. the one everyone loved. But something was wrong with that house. With them. Julian asked who she meant. Mrs. Hanley just shook her head. If the house is showing you her face again, maybe it wants the truth to come out. Later that week, Claire began acting differently. Quiet, distracted. She said she'd started hearing someone humming in the East Wing, a melody she couldn't remember but felt like she knew. Then, one night, she disappeared. They found her the next morning asleep in the attic, curled up beside the empty frame where the portrait had once hung. It was her, Claire whispered, shaking. She's not gone. She's just waiting. Julian didn't understand what was happening, but deep inside he felt something too. Not fear exactly, but the sense that someone had begun to remember. The face in the portrait had not changed, but when Julian returned to the study alone one evening, he found a second painting propped beside the first. Smaller, rougher, a sketch of a girl who looked older, sharper eyes, the same hair. But the mouth held something different. Bitterness. Julian was certain this painting hadn't been there before. He searched the attic. No sign of it. Claire refused to enter the study again. Julian now kept a journal. He wrote, "There were two sisters. That much is clear. But only one portrait. Only one name was erased. Why?" Theories began to form. One said the elder sister was jealous of the younger and did something terrible. Another claimed the younger vanished because she was never real, just an invention to hide a crime. And a third theory, spoken by the village priest in hushed tones, suggested this. That house never housed two sisters. Only one, but she could never decide which one she was. Julian laughed when he heard it, but only for a moment. Weeks later, Julian was leaving for the village when he glanced back at the window of the study. Two figures stood behind the glass, one in light, one in shadow. He returned inside. Only the portrait remained, but the mirror above the fireplace now had a long crack down its center, as if something had tried to divide its own reflection. And so, the story begins. Not with a name, not even with a face, but with a question. What was erased from the past, and who wanted it that way? The house with two shadows. At twilight, the Durnwood estate seemed almost beautiful again. With the sun low behind the hills and the windows catching its last light, the house glowed softly, like it remembered how to smile. But as the shadows grew longer, something strange happened. There were always two shadows in the upstairs window, two chairs pulled out at the dining table, two sets of footsteps across the creaking floorboards at night, even when Julian was alone, even when Claire was gone. The villagers noticed first. Funny, isn't it? One said. That house was always meant for two. But no one could explain who the second was, because Julian never brought a guest, and Claire hadn't come back since the morning they found her in the attic. The house had a way of revealing itself slowly. Behind each sealed door was a memory someone had tried to forget. Julian kept the main rooms open, the study, the hall, the kitchen. But the east wing remained locked, just like when he arrived. The keys didn't fit. The hinges refused to move. One day, while sorting through a drawer of old letters in the library, he found a scrap of paper tucked inside a hollow book cover. It was torn at the edge, but one sentence stood out clearly. It is always the quiet ones who carry the heaviest secrets. There was no name, no date, just that single line. That night, Julian tried to sleep but woke to music, soft, distant, familiar. A piano melody played somewhere in the east wing. It was impossible. The doors were still locked. When he reached the hallway, the sound stopped, but a faint scent of lilac hung in the air, fading but undeniably present. The next morning, the key to the east wing was lying on the windowsill. It hadn't been there before. Inside the east wing, the air was colder, not with winter's chill, but with something older. The hallway was lined with tall, oval mirrors. Each one cracked in the same place upper left corner to bottom right, as if they had all been struck by the same invisible hand. The last door on the left opened into a room untouched by time. Dust floated in still air. A vanity table, a chair by the window, and on the wall another portrait. But this one had two girls in it. Not a formal painting, just a sketch, rushed, almost frantic. One girl stood in front, smiling with innocence. The other, slightly behind, was drawn darker, her features sharper, her expression unreadable. They both looked familiar. Julian studied it for a long time before noticing the frame was nailed shut. Not hung, not propped, but sealed to the wall. He reached for it and froze. Behind him, in the mirror, something moved. Not a person, not a shadow. A blink, a suggestion of presence, a trick of light that didn't match the room behind him. When he turned, the room was unchanged, but the mirror now had a second crack, crossing the first. In the days that followed, the second shadow appeared more often, sometimes behind Julian as he worked, sometimes in the hallway just out of reach. He never saw it directly, but when he passed the tall mirrors, he often glimpsed someone walking just a step behind. He began speaking aloud in empty rooms. He didn't know why, not to banish the silence, but to answer something unspoken. As if the house was listening and waiting. One evening, he heard his own voice echo back to him, but not the words he had spoken, not in his tone. Julian started researching the sisters, more specifically, the difference between them. He discovered that Ellen, the elder, was known in the village for her composure and quiet beauty, always polite, always proper. Mariette, the younger, was spirited and curious, with a sharp mind and sharper questions, but records grew vague. Newspaper clippings ended abruptly. A fire in the town hall archives erased much of the estate's history. He asked the priest again. The old man hesitated, then finally said, "There were two of them, yes, but not always at once." Julian didn't understand. The priest added, "One would disappear for weeks, then return, then the other would vanish. We used to say, perhaps they were the same soul, split in two." A metaphor, he assumed, but it stuck in his mind, especially after what he saw next. Julian returned to the east wing at dusk. The hallway of mirrors felt different, tense, as if the house itself was watching. In the vanity room, the sketch of the two girls was gone. In its place, a new frame. Empty. Only a note lay on the chair. "You see only one at a time. But we are both always here." The ink was wet, fresh. Julian touched it, disbelieving, and suddenly the mirror before him flashed, not with light, but with memory. He saw two girls in the reflection facing each other. One held a silver hairbrush, the other a letter in her hand. Their mouths moved, but no sound came. Then one raised the brush. The image shattered. The mirror cracked a third time. Outside, the villagers said the estate looked brighter, more alive. They didn't know that inside, Julian had begun locking his door at night, not out of fear, but because the second shadow no longer stayed in mirrors. It now stood in doorways, watching, waiting, breathing. And so the question deepens, not whether there were two sisters, but whether the house itself remembers them differently than the world does, if it chooses what to show and what to hide. When the Duke arrived, the Duke arrived, the air grew strange. Not hot, not cold, just still, like the sky itself was holding its breath. He came unannounced, in a quiet carriage with no crest, no escort, no fanfare. Just a single trunk, a gloved driver, and a sealed letter addressed to Durnwood Hall. The villagers hadn't seen a noble in years, certainly not one so young, so alone. No one knew his full name. He was simply the Duke, and that was enough. He said he was passing through, but then he stayed. Julian found the letter tucked behind a loose panel in the study damp at the corners, but intact. It was not written to him. The seal matched a family crest he didn't recognize. 2 sparrows facing each other, one with open wings, the other folded. The letter was addressed to Miss M.D. The handwriting was elegant, sparse, controlled. Julian read it once, then twice. It wasn't a love letter. It was a warning. If she knows, it must end. If she doesn't, you must choose. No date, no signature. He had just begun to wonder who wrote it when the knock came. The Duke stood at the door, wearing a dark coat, not dusty from travel. His eyes were pale green, unreadable. His voice quiet but certain. "I believe this estate holds something that once belonged to me." Julian invited him in, cautiously. The Duke looked around the main hall without comment, as if he already knew the layout. He asked to see the portrait, not a portrait. The portrait. Julian led him to the study. The Duke said nothing for a long time, then, "She looks different than I remember." Julian asked, "You knew her?" The Duke didn't respond. He just stepped closer to the frame. "She used to sing in the garden, not loudly, barely more than a whisper." He reached toward the canvas, but stopped inches away. "Is it really her?" Julian didn't answer, but behind them, the mirror on the far wall shimmered just briefly, as if reacting. "The Duke stayed 3 nights. He said little." At little. Mostly walked the gardens alone. He asked questions not about the house, but about memory. "Do you think a person can be 2 things at once?" he asked Julian. "Of course," Julian replied. "We all are." The Duke looked unconvinced. "Not pretend. I mean really. To be one thing in the light, another in the dark, and not remember which is true." Julian asked if he was referring to someone. The Duke replied, "Not someone. 2 someones." That night, Julian heard voices in the hall, low, insistent, overlapping. He opened his door. Empty corridor. But 2 chairs at the end of the hall were facing each other now. The next morning, the Duke requested to see the attic. Julian hesitated, but agreed. When they opened the old door, the air inside was warmer than usual, less still, as if it had been disturbed. The frame that once held the portrait was gone, but something had been left behind. On the floor, between 2 sun-faded rugs, was a silver hairbrush. It was old, but not dusty, polished, cared for. The Duke picked it up gently, as if it were fragile. "She gave this to her sister," he said softly, "but I don't think she ever meant to." Julian frowned. "What do you mean?" The Duke looked at him. "Because the sister never brushed her own hair. Only hers." He paused. "You still think there were 2 girls, don't you?" Julian didn't answer. That evening, the Duke stood before the study mirror for a long time. When Julian entered, he didn't turn. "She told me once," the Duke said, "that mirrors are honest, more than people. She said that if I ever wanted to know the truth, I should look there." Julian said nothing. The Duke nodded toward the reflection. "I see her, but only when I stop looking." Julian looked too, just his own face. The Duke's beside him. But in the corner, barely visible, was the edge of a pale dress slipping out of frame. Neither of them moved. Then the room grew colder. That night, the Duke disappeared. His room untouched, his bag still at the foot of the bed, but the garden gate was open and the hairbrush was gone. Julian found only one thing on the study desk the next morning, the sealed letter, but now it was addressed to him. Inside, one line. "Only one of them loved me, but I never knew which." The letter that was never sent. It began with a drawer that refused to stay closed. Julian had opened it dozens of times. There was nothing inside, only dried ink, a cracked inkwell, and a faded wax seal stuck to the wood. But that evening, as the wind pressed against the windows and the house creaked with memories, the drawer slid open on its own. Inside, a letter, unfolded, untouched by time. It bore no address, no name, just a voice waiting to be heard. And the handwriting was careful, but rushed. a stream of thought caught mid-torrent, Julian sat by candlelight and read the words as if they might vanish if spoken aloud. I do not know if this will ever reach you. I do not know if I should want it to, but I have loved you. That is the beginning and the end of everything I cannot say. And if you are reading this, then you already know, or you never will. No signature, but he knew who had written it, not because of the words themselves, but because of the weight they carried. They weren't meant for him. They were meant for the Duke. Julian searched the desk, the study, the drawers again. Nothing. No envelope. No second page. Just this single message, unspoken, unfinished. He remembered what the Duke had said before disappearing. Only one of them loved me, but I never knew which. Now Julian began to wonder. What if she had tried to tell him? What if someone had stopped her? Claire returned the next day. She looked tired, pale, as though the night had followed her home. Julian found her in the east wing, sitting beside the cracked mirror. She didn't look at him when he approached. It was never sent, she said. Julian froze. You saw it? Claire nodded slowly. She wrote it in the west garden. I remember. She sat by the ivy wall. The sunlight made her hair look like it was on fire. Julian hesitated. Which one? Claire blinked. I don't know. Her voice trembled. I was sure it was Mariette, but then I heard Ellen's voice in my dream, saying it was hers, that she wrote it, that she always wrote everything. Julian stepped closer. Did someone take the letter? Claire looked into the mirror and whispered, I think she never meant it to be read. The next evening, something changed in the study. The portrait had been removed again. Only this time, it hadn't been taken. It had walked. That's what Julian wrote in his journal. Not stolen. Not missing. Walked. Because the frame was still warm to the touch, and the faint outline of footsteps' bare feet led away across the dust. Julian followed them. They ended at the library fireplace, and in the grate, untouched by ash, sat a second letter, this one sealed. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he called Claire. They sat together as he carefully broke the wax. Inside, a different tone, sharper, more composed. You think you know which of us wrote to him. You don't? And even if you did, what difference would it make? He chose. And that was the last mistake he ever made. Julian and Claire exchanged a glance. Then Claire whispered, There was a third letter. Julian stared at her. Claire pressed her palm against the mirror, watching her reflection ripple slightly. It was never found, but they say she wrote it the night before the engagement, before the garden went silent, before the ivy turned grey. They searched for hours, every hallway, every drawer, even behind the cracked mirrors. At last, in the servants' stairwell, behind a loosened stone, Julian found a folded slip of parchment, faded, torn, one word still visible. Forgive. That was all. The rest had crumbled away. Later that night, Claire stood alone in the rose garden. The roses were pale, like the ones from Julian's dream, almost white. She whispered into the quiet, Mariette? No answer. Then, Ellen? Still silence, but the wind stirred the ivy wall, just enough to uncover a corner of something hidden. She stepped forward and found it, a ribbon, deep red, tied tightly around a bundle of dried flowers, and beneath them a small, leather-bound journal. The pages were nearly blank, but one held writing, pressed deep into the page as if written in anger or desperation. You cannot poison what was never pure. You cannot bury what will not stay dead. Claire stared at the words, her hands trembling. She turned the page. Nothing, but as she held the journal up to the fading sunlight, faint letters emerged. Invisible ink, perhaps, or just time revealing what it had hidden. A name appeared at the bottom of the final page, Mariette. That night, Julian added to his journal. There were 3 letters, one written out of love, one written out of spite, and one never finished. He paused, then wrote. Or perhaps they were all written by the same hand, just at different times, by different versions of the same girl. When he looked up, the mirror across the room was no longer cracked. It was whole, but it reflected no one. Not him, not Claire, not anyone. And in the corner of the frame, carved freshly into the wood, were 5 letters, M-D-E-E-R. They didn't form a name, but they might form a question, or a warning. Whose story was this, truly? And who was still writing it? Poison in the garden. Not in the cup. In late August, the garden stopped blooming. The roses turned pale, the lavender wilted without reason, and even the ivy along the west wall began to dry and fall in brittle threads. Julian noticed it first, then Claire, then the silence. No birds, no wind, just an unnatural stillness, the kind of quiet that follows when something sacred is broken. Julian walked the grounds daily now, not to explore, but to make sure nothing else had changed, and yet something always had. A branch that wasn't broken yesterday now hung limp. A path that once led to the orchard now curved toward the garden bench, and the bench itself had shifted slightly, closer to the rose bushes and to the empty patch of soil behind them, the patch that never grew anything, not even weeds. That's where Claire found the spoon. Not old, not rusted, polished silver, clean, as if someone had just placed it there. She picked it up with trembling fingers and turned it in the light. A single word engraved on the handle, Mariette. Julian examined it in the study. It didn't match the rest of the estate's silverware. It wasn't listed in the inventory. But it wasn't that unsettled him. It was the memory. He had seen that spoon before, in the portrait, on the small table next to Mariette's hand. Everyone had focused on her face, her eyes, her expression, but no one had looked at what she was holding, a teacup, and beside it, this spoon. Julian returned to the attic and found the old canvas now resting against the far wall. He brought it back into the light and saw it clearly for the first time. The teacup in her hand was tipped slightly, and her smile, not kind, not warm, it was knowing, almost triumphant. Claire, meanwhile, had begun to walk the gardens again. She said she felt watched, not by a ghost, but by memory. She had begun speaking to the ivy wall, as if waiting for it to answer. One afternoon, Julian found her standing motionless before it. In her hand, a withered rose. In her other, the journal they had found. She looked at him and said, "Do you remember what the Duke said?" Julian nodded. That only one of them loved him. Claire shook her head. No, before that, when we found the hairbrush. She held up the spoon. He said, "She gave it to her sister, but I don't think she ever meant to." They began to piece it together, slowly, reluctantly. There had been 2 girls, or perhaps 1. There had been a gift, perhaps 2, a brush, a letter, a spoon. But not all were symbols of love. Some were tools, of guilt, of silence, of poison. But the poison had never been in the cup. It had been in the garden all along, in the herbs someone had cultivated, in the soil carefully maintained, in the dried leaves pressed between the pages of a book they hadn't yet found, and more than that, it had been in words unspoken, in a glance held too long, in a sister's silence while the other wrote, in the night before the engagement, and when something had changed forever. Julian found the book 3 days later. It had no title, just a pressed flower on the cover, dark purple. Inside, hundreds of pages of herbal notations, doses, reactions, observations, most written in the same small hand until the final page, larger, slanted, angry. She made me drink it, not from a cup, but from trust. It was signed M. Julian didn't show Claire the book, not immediately. He wasn't sure what it meant. Not yet. But that night, As he sat alone in the study, he opened the cracked mirror journal again and found a new entry. It hadn't been there before. Same hand, same pressure in the strokes. You looked in the wrong place. It was never the tea. It was the garden that whispered to her, and she listened. There was no signature, but the last letter drawn in the bottom corner was a single E. Claire had a dream that night. She was in the rose garden again, but it was blooming now, wild, crimson, alive. Two girls sat on the bench. One held a book, the other held her wrist. When Claire moved closer, she realized something. It wasn't a memory, it was a warning. She woke up with the taste of metal in her mouth and a rose petal on her pillow. That morning, Julian stood beside the window and watched the light shift. The spoon lay on his desk, the journal was gone, and in the mirror behind him, only one reflection, his own, but he no longer trusted it. So what had really happened? Had a sister been poisoned? Had a sister poisoned the other? Or had both done something far worse? Something not out of hate, but out of love twisted too tight to breathe. In the end, the truth was this. The garden was never meant to feed. It was meant to remember, and some memories bloom only after something has withered away. What she said before the clock struck 5. The day began with fog, not the usual morning mist that rolled down from the hills. This was heavier, denser, as if the house itself was exhaling. It seeped through the windows, curled along the stair rails, hung thick in the east wing like breath held too long. And in the silence of that morning, the old grandfather clock in the main hall paused. It stopped at 4:45 and refused to move. Claire was the one who heard her first. A voice, faint, but not from the attic or the garden, from the rose room, the room they had never truly opened, not since the Duke disappeared. The door was unlocked, but stuck, as if it had swollen in the damp. Julian pushed. The wood groaned, and then it opened. The room smelled like dried lavender and smoke, as if something had once been burned, but not completely. At the centre, on the velvet settee by the fireplace, lay a girl, not asleep, not quite awake. Her dress was pale, her skin paler, but her eyes are open and clear. She looked at them as if she'd been waiting for years. Julian stepped forward. "Mariette." The girl didn't answer. Claire whispered, "Ellen." Still no reply, but the girl smiled, not kindly, not cruelly, just tired. "I didn't think it would take this long," she said. "But you found the letters." Julian and Claire exchanged a look. "You were the one who wrote them?" Claire asked. The girl's eyes flicked toward the fireplace. "I wrote the first one. She wrote the second. The third. Neither of us finished." Julian moved closer. "Which of you are you?" The girl looked at him, expressionless, and replied, "Yes." The clock chimed once. 4:46. The girl flinched. "It's nearly time," she whispered. "I don't have much left." Claire asked, "What happened that night?" The girl closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, they were wet. "I loved him, but I couldn't be what he wanted. Not both of me." Julian sat beside her. "He loved one of you." "No," she said. "He thought he did, but he never knew which was which." Claire's voice trembled. "Did you poison her?" The girl didn't react. Instead, she asked, "Is that what the garden told you?" She coughed, lightly, but the sound was sharp in the stillness. "Do you know what they said about us?" she asked. "That we were mirrors, that if you stared too long, you couldn't tell who was real." She smiled faintly. "That's the curse. You forget which one you were pretending to be." Julian leaned forward. "Then tell us, just once, the truth." The girl looked down at her hands, fragile, still. She began to speak, but the clock struck 4:59. One long, echoing tone. The house held its breath. She looked up at Claire. She wrote the last letter, but it was never finished. She tried to confess. I think she wanted to be forgiven. Claire swallowed. Did you forgive her? The girl nodded slowly. I did. But not then. Not before. Ah! She closed her eyes. And never out loud. Julian whispered, Was it Ellen? The girl opened her eyes, and for the first time, something broke in her face. A flicker of fear. She'll come when the clock strikes 5, she said. I don't know who you'll see. The final chime rang through the house. 5 o'clock. The fireplace sparked once, without flame, and the girl was gone. Not vanished, not disappeared. She was simply no longer there. The velvet settee was empty, but the air still held warmth, and in the corner of the room the mirror fogged briefly. 2 silhouettes, one seated, one standing, then clear again. Julian turned to Claire, and they didn't speak. They couldn't. Not yet, because the door behind them creaked slowly shut, on its own, and the clock, stuck for so long, now began to move again, backwards, tick by tick. On the settee lay a single piece of paper, not a letter, a name, written in red ink, simple, deliberate. Ellen? Oh, but in the garden that night, when Claire returned alone, she found the spoon. Buried. Clean. And beside it, one petal. Blood red. Folded carefully around a torn scrap of paper. The last line read, She forgave me, but I never asked. The mirror still reflects. They thought it would be over when the clock struck 5, that the last truth would rise like morning mist and then disappear into light. But some stories don't end. They echo. And this one had not finished speaking. For the next 3 days, the house was still. Too still. The fog cleared, but the air inside remained thick, like it had absorbed everything that had been said and wasn't done listening. The mirrors stopped cracking, but they also stopped reflecting clearly. Shapes moved in the glass, but never when you looked directly at them. Only in the corner of the eye, only when you blinked. Julian wrote less in his journal. He said the house no longer gave him answers, only more questions. Claire stopped going into the rose garden. She said the ivy whispered now, not loudly, but with familiarity, as if it knew her name. One morning, Julian found a new letter on his desk, folded, unsigned. He thought it might be from Claire. But she denied it. Inside, 3 lines. You know who I was. You know what I did. But you still don't know who I am. There was no signature, just the shape of a fingerprint in wax. Not a seal, not an emblem, just a single human touch, pressed too deep to remove. That same day, the portrait reappeared. Not in the study, not in the attic, in the mirror. Not a painting, not real, but the reflection of it, standing at the end of the hall where no frame hung. Claire saw it first. She called for Julian, but when they returned, only a mirror, only themselves. And yet, for the briefest moment, Claire had seen something different. Not one girl, 2, standing together, but not looking at each other. Looking at her. Julian began covering the mirrors at night, all of them, one by one, but the cloth would fall by morning, and beneath it the glass always felt warm, alive, waiting. In the final entry of his journal, Julian wrote, Perhaps there were 2 sisters. Perhaps there was only one, but there is something worse than not knowing. It's thinking you finally do, and realizing you don't. They decided to leave the house. Claire packed her journals. Julian took only one thing, the hairbrush. But on the morning they were meant to leave, the front door refused to open. Not jammed, not locked, just closed. as if something was not done with them. Claire walked the halls one last time. She passed the long mirror outside the rose room and paused, because this time it reflected two of her, not side by side, not synchronized. One moved slightly after the other, like a memory that hadn't yet caught up. The next day, a letter arrived at the village post. No return address, just 3 words inside. The mirror lied. The paper smelled faintly of lavender. Weeks later, the house remains silent, unoccupied. But some nights, villagers say they see candles flicker behind the upper windows. Sometimes 2, sometimes just 1. And if you stand at the front gate, in the hour before dawn, you might see a figure in the garden. Or 2. You won't know which. And the truth is, neither do they. Because the mirror still reflects 2, and one of them is still waiting.